Have you ever thought about how a place can have its own government, its own military, and its own currency? I mean, it acts just like any other sovereign country, and yet most of the world doesn't officially recognize it as one. Well, that's the Taiwan paradox. So let's dive in and try to decode how this pretty unique situation came to be.
At the heart of it all is one huge question. Is there one China, or are there two? Now, the answer is way more complicated than it sounds, and it's something that shapes the politics of the entire Indo-Pacific region.
So, to really get our heads around this puzzle, we're going to walk through 5 chapters. We'll start at the beginning with the history, then look at the reality of Taiwan's status today, how it deals with the rest of the world, the current tensions, and finally, what the future might hold.
All right, first up, a little bit of history. You see, the roots of today's paradox aren't really about recent events. They go way back to a civil war in the last century, a war that, in a lot of ways, never actually ended.
This timeline really shows how these two paths split apart. After a long time under the Qing dynasty and then 50 years of rapid modernization as a Japanese colony, Taiwan was given to the Republic of China after World War II. But 1949, that was the critical moment. The Chinese Civil War came to an end. The defeated government, the Republic of China, or ROC, fled to Taiwan. Back on the mainland, the victorious Communist Party set up the People's Republic of China, the PRC. And here's the absolute key. No peace treaty was ever signed. The war was essentially put on ice, frozen in time. And this created this incredibly strange situation where you have two rival governments, the PRC in Beijing and the ROC in Taipei. And both of them claimed to be the one true legitimate government of all of China. But, while that political conflict was frozen, Taiwan itself was anything but. It started carving out its own unique path, building the foundations of what we now call a de facto state. So what do we even mean by a de facto state? It's a really important term to understand here. Basically, it just means a place that is, for all practical purposes, independent. It acts like a country, it runs itself like a country, even if it doesn't have that official stamp of approval from the rest of the world. Taiwan really built its modern identity on two incredibly strong pillars. First, there was an economic miracle. It went from just exporting simple goods to becoming a high-tech powerhouse. And then there was the Quiet Revolution, a peaceful shift from a one-party state under martial law to a really vibrant democracy through the late 80s and 90s. And the result of that huge transformation? Well, today, Taiwan's economy is the 20th largest in the entire world. Now, that's not just a number on a chart. It represents real economic muscle and a deep connection to the global economy that, frankly, makes it essential.
Which brings us to the world stage. I mean, if Taiwan is so successful and democratic, why doesn't the world just officially recognize it? Well, this is where the plot thickens, and diplomacy turns into a very, very delicate dance.
You have to look really closely at the words being used here because in diplomacy, these tiny details mean everything. China has its one China principle. For them, it's an absolute, non-negotiable fact that Taiwan is part of China, period. But then you have the U.S. with its one China policy. The U.S. acknowledges China's position, but, and this is so important, it doesn't recognize or agree with it. Japan and a lot of other countries do something similar, picking their words so carefully to try and keep things stable. This whole diplomatic tightrope act has a name: strategic ambiguity. It's all about being intentionally unclear. The goal is to keep everyone guessing. It's meant to stop China from invading, because they can't be 100% sure the U.S. won't get involved, and it's meant to stop Taiwan from formally declaring independence, because they can't be 100% sure the U.S. will get involved. It's fragile, for sure, but so far it's kept the peace.
So, how does all this history and diplomacy actually play out today? That brings us to the forces that are creating both the tension and the very precarious balance we see right now.
The modern standoff is really defined by two huge opposing forces. On one side, you've got China's massive and growing military might, which is a constant threat. But on the other side, you have Taiwan's silicon shield. What's that? Well, its semiconductor industry, especially the company TSMC, is so dominant, so critical for everything from our phones to our cars, that an attack on Taiwan would send the entire world economy into a tailspin. And that's a powerful modern deterrent. And all this creates a massive dilemma for Taiwan. Think about it. China is its biggest trading partner. So much of its prosperity is tied to the mainland, but that very economic link makes it vulnerable, giving Beijing leverage. So Taiwan is constantly trying to balance its prosperity with its security and self-reliance. It's a huge challenge. So that brings us to our final and maybe most important question. If this situation is so tense, so full of contradictions, why does it continue? Why does this ambiguous status quo just persist?
The answer really comes down to some cold, hard math, a strategic calculation. For every major player here, China, Taiwan, and the United States, keeping things as they are, even with all the problems, has always been seen as the next best option. Nobody loves it, but the alternatives seem a whole lot worse. Let's break down the thinking, starting with China. The cost of a full-blown invasion would be catastrophic, unbelievable economic damage, and they'd become a pariah on the world stage. Right now, the status quo lets them benefit economically while keeping the dream of unification alive for the future. But they do have one absolute red line, a formal declaration of Taiwan independence.
Now let's flip it. What about Taiwan's calculation? Well, the status quo gives them pretty much everything they want in practice: freedom, democracy, a strong economy. A formal declaration of independence, on the other hand, would almost certainly start a devastating war. So the prevailing strategy is to maintain the reality of their situation without pushing for a symbolic change that could trigger a disaster.
And finally, the U.S. The status quo means stability in East Asia, and crucially, it keeps those vital semiconductor supply chains safe. The alternative, a direct war with a nuclear-armed China, is just an almost unthinkable scenario. So the U.S. strategy is to thread a very fine needle, help Taiwan defend itself, but don't support an official move to independence that could light the fuse.
So, when you put it all together, the essence of the Taiwan issue is this deep, ongoing paradox. It was created by a civil war that never officially ended, and it's kept in place by this delicate geopolitical balance, where, for everyone involved, the enormous cost of changing things is just way, way higher than any of the potential benefits.
And don't think for a second this is just a regional issue. As Professor Yasuhiro Matsuda says, the stakes really could not be higher. If this delicate balance collapses, the shockwaves could be felt across the entire planet, potentially shaking the very foundation of the international order we've had since the end of World War II.
And all of this leaves us with one final pretty heavy question. This whole intricate balance is built on a set of calculations. But what happens as military technology changes, as economies shift, and as the global balance of power keeps evolving? Just how long can this calculated, fragile balance actually hold?